Hello, my name is Alex. In this video, we will be looking at two very interesting things inside Excel Visual Basic. One of them is the message box, and the other one is the input box. Let's say, for example, we have a variable called my text to show. This is a text, and this is basically a variable that holds a string that we want to show to the user at a given time. By writing message box, you will see now that we have lots of inputs that we can specify. As you can see, this first parameter called prompt, it's a mandatory value that you have to put. If you don't put a value in prompt, an error will appear. The other parameters that appear in square brackets are optional arguments. You don't need to put them. Let's say, for example, we want just to show for the moment the variable. If we now click play, this is a text. Notice that when the message box or the input box are active and are showing something, the code won't execute until the user clicks something. So, for example, if we do this, you will see that this message box will execute, and this part of the code won't execute until we do something with this one. You see? Let's look at the other parameters. We have also buttons as Visual Basic message box style. By default, the value is Visual Basic OK only. For the time being, we're going to leave this parameter optional. We can put another comma and it will jump to the next argument, in this case the title. Let's say, for example, we want to put a title called "This is a new title." If we now execute this, you will see in the message box that in the upper part you have "This is a new title," and inside it you have "This is a text." Okay, so as you see, the message box is very easy to use. Now what we can see is how can we personalize how the message box appears to the user. I've written down, according to the Excel Visual Basic documentation, all the possible things that you can do. You can specify the buttons that you want to appear in the message box. For example, just the OK button, which is the default, OK and cancel, abort, retry and ignore, yes, no and cancel, yes, no, and retry and cancel. Also, you can add an icon to the message box. One of them is the critical icon, the question icon, exclamation, and information. Take into account that, for example, the critical icon will make the message box play a sound when activated. You can also specify the default button that you want the message box to have by default press, which can be the first button, the second button, or the third button. They normally go in order. So, for example, in abort, retry, and ignore, abort is the first button, retry is the second, and ignore is the third. Finally, you can specify which is the behavior of the message box. By default is Visual Basic Application Modal. This means that Excel won't respond until the user clicks the message box. You can also change it to Visual Basic System Modal. This freezes all operations in the system until the user clicks the message box. This means that the user cannot minimize, for example, Excel and go to another application. So in this space that we have now here, we're going now to generate an example argument that we can use. Let's say, for example, that we are going to use the Visual Basic abort, retry, ignore, or, well, no, let's say the yes, no, cancel. The icon, we're going to say we're going to use the question, and that's it. Let's say we're going to create the style like that. So for example, you can do message box style. We are going to define the variable. So you just now need to write, like, for example, Visual Basic, yes, no, cancel. And you have to add, for example, a Visual Basic question. Okay? And if you put now this here and you execute this message box, you will see you have the previous title that we already had and the text. But now we have this icon that is a question icon. We have this button that, well, it's Spanish, it says sí, but it's in English, yes. We have no, and we have cancel. Okay? Okay, so now I've written down the values that a message box can give us, which are all these values. This will be, for example, the constant, and this will be the numeric value that is interpreted by Excel. So, what are the possible return values? If we click the OK button, it will return Visual Basic OK. If we click the cancel button or the X in the message box, it will return the cancel. Abort if we click abort, retry, ignore, yes, and no. Okay? Very easy. So, how do we retrieve the value from a message box? From which is the key that the user press? Well, we can assign a variable to this message box. For example, my returned value. And you have also to put this in parentheses. Okay, so now whatever the user clicks here will be registered in here. So we know that we have the following cases. The user can either press yes, no, or cancel. You have to take into account that the user will always be able to press the cancel key, even if you are using the OK only or the abort, retry, ignore. Why? Because in the message box, the red X to close a window is interpreted as a cancel button. Okay, so I prepared this little example to see what's the actual value being returned. So as you can see, what will happen here is here we define some variables for our message box. Here we put our message box with the variables that we want, so will be shown to the user, and whatever the user presses will be stored in this variable, in my returned value. Here we will show what is the returned value of this variable, which can be either 1, 2, 3, up until 7. And in here, we will also show a debug print message to actually specify if we clicked yes, no, and cancel, which is the 3 different feedbacks that we are expecting. So let's check it out. We now click run. This is a text. For example, we click no. You will see that the number returned here is 7, which is the equivalent of no, and the user clicked no. As you might have seen, there are also 2 additional arguments for the message box. One is the help file and the context. Help file is basically the directory of where your help file for this message box is stored. And the context is that when Excel opens this help file, where should it go? For example, let's say that you have the typical help of Excel, which contains a series of different contexts, and you want to open the help file in the context number 50. If you specify a help file parameter, you also have to specify the context parameter. In our case, we don't have any help file, so normally, at least in my case, I never use the help file or the context. And basically with this, we are done with the message box, and now what we are left with is with the input box. Okay, so the input box is rather simple to use. So let's say, for example, that instead of the user pressing some buttons, we want the user to input text. How can we do this? The values of the input box are normally stored in a variable. So let's say we want to store whatever the user introduces in the input box in a variable called feedback from user. And now we write application dot input box, and as you can see, we have some parameters that we can introduce, being the only needed parameter the first one, and the rest of them are optional. For this first example, we are going just to put the prompt as a string. So this is basically a message that will be shown to the user, like for example, input something, please. Okay. And we can do a debug.print of whatever is here. So you can see the result in the immediate window. If we now execute this, input something, please. I like this. And as you can see, here you have it. Okay, so I've written down the different data types that we can have for the input box. When you write this down, you are telling the input box which values it should expect. If the user tries to put a data type different from the one specified, an error message will show. By default, in our case, we are not putting any data type, so technically it will allow you to put anything. Let's see how we can use the data types and the rest of the arguments inside the input box. As you can see, as well as in the message box, we have the title parameter. So this is a title, for example. It will appear in the upper part of the input box. Then we have the default argument. This is the default value that will be in the input box when it's open up. So let's say, for example, we want a default value of 50 to be shown. The parameters left and top indicate how many pixels is going to be separated the input box from the left part of the screen and the top part of the screen. In this case, we don't want to touch this, so we're just going to leave them empty. As well as in the message box, here we have the help file and the help context ID. In our case, we don't want to include any help file, so we can just ignore this. And finally, the last optional argument, which is the type. As you can see, we have put in the default parameter a value of 50. So technically, we are expecting the user to give us a number. So let's say 1. If we now execute this again, you will see that we have now the title, we have the input something, please. We have a default value of 50. And if, for example, we try to introduce a text and we click on OK, number is not valid. Okay, so I'm going to put now a number, like for example 17. Okay. As you can see, the input box and the message box are fairly easy to use and can let the user provide some inputs to your application. To summarize, in this tutorial, we have seen how to properly use the message box and the input box and all the functionalities that they have.